Okay, let's get started. Again, welcome everybody to the awarding of the Eric Zencey Prize in Ecological Economics. I'm really delighted to be part of this event that's awarding the second such prize in this new program of ours. My name is Taylor Ricketts, and I'm the director of the Gund Institute for Environment here at the University of Vermont. And I'm going to be the MC today, just briefly introducing people after a couple of introductory remarks of my own. First, I want to say that for those needing closed captioning, you'll find a link in the chat to the closed captioning. And then I'd like to say that the Gund Institute is a interdisciplinary research and action center based at the University of Vermont, focused on sustainability problems globally and uniting disciplines across the university and across the world to try to focus on and solve the world's outstanding environmental problems. We also, more specifically to this, we co-host the Eric Zencey Prize in Ecological Economics with the US Society for Ecological Economics. And that's what gathers us here today. So as I said, I'm just going to be the MC and quick introducer, and I'm going to keep things moving so we get to our actual speaker and guest today. In fact, let me just introduce him, or at least welcome him right now. Tim Jackson's here with us. He is the winner of this year's Zencey Prize for his book, Post-Growth. He'll be introduced formally later after a couple more introductory remarks from people, but I just wanted to welcome and congratulate him now at the very beginning. So Tim, hello and welcome and congratulations.
Thank you, Taylor, and thanks for inviting me. It's absolutely wonderful to be here, and I feel very honored to have been awarded the prize.
Well, we're honored that your book is now part of the prize series we have. So I'm going to introduce next Matt Zencey, who is Eric Zencey's brother. He's been a wonderful partner in devising this award, this prize, and in managing it since its inception. It's been great to get to know him alongside all our relationships with Eric for so many years. So Matt, take it away. Tell us a little bit more about the prize and its goals and et cetera.
Okay, well, I think the best way for me to do that is to offer some quotes from Eric himself. First, let's start with his understanding of ecological economics. At its most basic, he wrote, ecological economics is economics as if the planet were finite and the laws of thermodynamics apply to us. His intent with this award in the field was, quote, to reward work that integrates the laws of thermodynamics into economic analysis that is put before the general public, unquote. And you'll note his use of what I call the T word, thermodynamics. It was a foundational element of what he wanted to accomplish with this award. He said, quote, integration of the laws of thermodynamics into economic analysis is central to the mission of this prize and should not be swept under a rug. Another key idea with the award was, as he put it, quote, to get these particular ideas out of the academy and put them to work in the world. He wanted them to be part of the public conversation. He believed, quoting from him here, many of our current psychosocial political ills, including Trumpism, have a deep root in the failure of a perpetual growth economy to grow fast enough to satisfy all the claims made on it. Spreading the word about ecological economics was, in Eric's mind, the most powerful and most hopeful thing he could do to drive the changes he believed human civilization needs to make. This prize is his way of encouraging that mission long after his death. And with that, I also want to say a huge thanks to the Gund Institute for its support of what my brother wanted to accomplish with this award. Our family could not have created the organizational structure needed to administer the award. The Gund has made it possible to realize his vision and honor Eric's legacy, and for that, we're deeply grateful. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to say how proud and honored we are to be the organization that you all trusted to carry forward this prize. And just listening to those quotes from Eric, which so many of us on this screen knew quite well, it makes it really clear why Tim Jackson's book won. It's just so related and right on the bullseye of the intent of this award and the intellectual legacy of Eric. So next up is Josh Farley, who is a colleague of ours here at University of Vermont, a professor, a fellow of the Gund Institute, author of the still definitive textbook on ecological economics with Herman Daly, and he was co-chair of the committee that selected this book. So over to you, Josh.
Right. And I was also a friend of Eric Zencey's, so I was happy to do this. So the Zencey Prize, is awarded to a book or long-form journalism published in the last 2 years that applies the principles of ecological economics to addressing real-world environmental challenges, and it's written for a general audience, so we can really just spread the ideas. We had 25 applicants this year, twice as many as last year, 20 books, huge range of subject matter from environmental histories of specific ecosystems to these calls for systemic changes to the economic system to realign it with planetary constraints, as Tim's book, the approach Tim's book took. And our selection process, so Joe Roman and I are the co-chairs of the Eric Zencey Prize Committee, and it's our task to kind of filter through all the nominees to find the 3 best. There were too many this year, so actually we turned it over to one of my grad school grad courses in ecological economic theory, where students each would read one book and then write a little blurb about whether or not it was a contender for the prize. And then Joe and I also skimmed through or read all the books. I read, I think both of us read Tim Jackson's book quite closely because it was excellent. And then we turned those, we chose the 3 finalists to turn them over to the selection committee, which was Matt Zencey as a representative of the Zencey family. Laura is a representative of the USSEE, and then Rubena Anjum as a representative of the Gund Institute. And after careful deliberation, they unanimously agreed on Tim's book as being one that really best captured the goals of the Zencey Prize. And, his book, it really does tackle the systemic changes needed to build an ecological economy. He has a chapter in there about the importance of storytelling, does an amazing job at telling the stories that actually show how we can forge a much more attractive future than what currently looms before us. And this idea that ending growth is not a sacrifice, but, the inevitable result of maturity in any biological system is an end to growth. So it really, lays out a meaningful economic future that helps restore a lot of the relationships that make being human so wonderful. And he lays out a vision of a future I would like to inhabit. And with that, I will, I think that's enough to be said about that, actually. I'll turn it back to the MC.
All right, thanks, Josh. That's fantastic. Okay, last up before Tim Jackson actually gets to speak for himself, is Laura Schmidt-Olivisi. She's the president of the United States Society for Ecological Economics. She's an associate professor at Michigan State in the Department of Community Sustainability. She studies all these things, social ecological systems, academic and stakeholder knowledge being blended to understand them. And she is going to finally introduce Tim Jackson and make the award of the prize ahead of his own remarks. So thanks so much for being here, Laura, and over to you.
Thanks, Taylor. It's a great pleasure to be here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with USSEE, it is the US chapter of the International Society for Ecological Economics, and we're an interdisciplinary society of academics and practitioners working on sustainability issues. So it's my great pleasure as the president and as a member of the Zencey Committee to award the 2022 Zencey Prize to Tim Jackson for his book, Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism. Tim Jackson is an ecological economist and a writer. Since 2016, he has been director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey in the UK, where he has also been professor of sustainable development since the year 2000. From 2004 to 2011, he was economics commissioner for the UK Sustainable Development Commission, where his work culminated in the publication of Prosperity Without Growth, another excellent book that was subsequently translated to 17 different languages worldwide. This book, Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism, was published in 2021. And I found it interesting, this little tidbit, that in addition to academic writing, Tim has also written for the radio, for the BBC radio, which is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that later. So Jackson's book argues that the pursuit of economic growth has delivered climate catastrophe, social inequity, and financial instability, leaving society ill-prepared for a global pandemic and other problems that we're probably going to have coming down the line. Weaving together economic insight, social vision, and philosophical reflection, the provocative text dares us to envision a world beyond capitalism, a place where relationship and meaning take precedence over profits and power. And I will just say that as one of the committee that awarded the prize and that read this book, I was really taken by the fresh and modern feel of the writing, and also the hopeful and solutions focused nature of the book. And so it is now my great pleasure to introduce Tim Jackson to share some of his writing with you this evening. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks to everyone on the Zencey Prize committee, including those students who read the book. I can't really describe how much of an honor it is to be awarded this. And I think that's partly because that ecological economics has for 30 years almost been my intellectual home. And as everyone who tries to critique the growth myth will attest, finding an intellectual home for ideas such as that isn't easy. But there's also a sense in which this was for me a very personal project. It was in some ways a drawing together of my intellectual work on ecological economics and my playwriting to the BBC, and story, as you've mentioned, was an important part of the writing in the book. And there's another reason which I'll come to, why I'm particularly pleased to have been awarded this particular award from Eric Zencey. But I was asked to select some short readings from Post-Growth for tonight. I have to say I found it quite challenging, though it did, of course, give me a chance to go back and find all the places I could have written things better. It also made me realize that for the writer, at least, the book is never finished, it's just published. Anyway, I've selected 3 short extracts, and this first one comes from the very beginning of the book, from the prologue. The world starts to shake, wrote the sociologist Peter Berger, in the very instant that its sustaining conversation begins to falter. The year 2020 bore undeniable witness to this inconvenient truth. Our sustaining conversation didn't just falter, it did an abrupt about turn and slapped us in the face hard. No surprise then that even today the world feels more than a little shaky. It had all been going so well. The sun rose resplendent over the highest town in Europe in the 3rd week of January. Its early morning light shone magnificently on the snow-capped peaks, shimmering gold against a sky of deep alpine blue, nature in all her glory. The perfect backdrop to the annual congregation of privilege and power, the premiers and the billionaires, the limousines and the helicopters. The 50th World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, was about to begin. It's a jamboree, my host confided as he picked me up from the small train station late the night before and showed me to my temporary accommodation, a borrowed apartment set back from the town overlooking the mountains. It's a jungle, replied his companion, and we all managed to laugh. Our leaders know the rules of the game. They understand intuitively that this ostentatious pageant is a beauty parade. The stakes are always high. The spotlights must gleam on sharp suits and slick haircuts. The cavalcades must jostle for superiority. The rhetoric must be finely tuned to the peculiar struggles of the day. The sun must shine dutifully on the righteous. The charade must leave no room for doubt. The mountains themselves must forever seal the bargain struck in the basements of history. More begets more. Power begets power. Growth begets growth. To them that hath, it shall be given. They've been jetting into this dazzling resort for 5 decades now, pledging allegiance to the great god growth. Come snow or shine, foul weather or fine, their task has always been crystal clear: to bring succor to the weak, courage to the faint of heart, to slay the dragons of doubt wherever they may arise. Economic growth is just a confidence trick, as long as we believe it will happen. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. There are invariably plenty of dragons. This year was no different. Europe was worried about the rise of populism. Australia was anxious about the fires still raging through its long black summer. The US was worried about the trade war with China. Almost everyone was suddenly worried about carbon. Climate change was the surprise beneficiary of this year's struggle for attention. The school strikes of 2019 had finally pushed the matter to the very top of the forum's list of long-term risks to growth. That was a first. Against the odds, a broad, though not quite unanimous consensus emerged from Davos that something would have to be done before the floods and the bushfires, or the annoying activists who occasionally blocked the flow of limousines into and out of the town, derailed the economic bandwagon. The impatience of our young people is something we should tap, then German Chancellor Angela Merkel told the conference. She was referring, of course, to the extraordinary leadership shown by the young Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, who was there in town for a second time, speaking truth to power with the extraordinary clarity of a seer, a dove amongst the pigeons. This year, the simplicity of her message had drawn a whole new generation of activists into a battlefield they could barely recognize. They looked around them in defiance and awe. Merkel was not the only old timer to find a tear of sympathy welling in her eye. Not everyone was impressed. Is she the chief economist, or who is she? I'm confused, joked the US Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin. In a moment, he must surely have regretted almost instantly. After she goes and studies economics in college, she can come back and explain that to us. When you're in a hole, Stephen, stop digging. But they couldn't, of course, stop digging. The then President Donald Trump was determined to place this nonsense in the wider context of an undying creed. To embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse, he proclaimed. They are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers. Our hero gazes out across the savannah of upturned faces towards the horizon of endless opportunity. I imagine a self-satisfied speechwriter somewhere smiling smugly. Life is just a Hollywood B movie. Paradise is a land forged from a frontier mentality. Burn it down, dig it up, build over it. Progress is a construction site. It may look messy for now, but tomorrow's shopping malls and condominiums will be a glorious sight. Let those who doubt this vision perish. The school kids, the climate strikers, the extinction rebels, they can all go to hell. The heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers be damned. Compulsory optimism is the flavor of the day, and the blindingly obvious is expunged from the discourse of power. The snow above Davos grows thinner each year. The alpine ski season is a month shorter than it was when Klaus Schwab first founded the forum in 1971. The climate is changing, the ice is melting, 1 million species are facing extinction. We're shifting ecological balances in totally unpredictable ways. The finite planet we call home is being altered, perhaps irreversibly, by the massive expansion in human activity that parades under the seductive banner of progress. But please, don't bring these realities to our attention. We've worked so hard not even to acknowledge them. Within weeks, that easy denial seemed like yesterday's wisdom. The end of the warmest January on record held a harsh lesson in store. Few were aware of it, even in privileged Davos. Some over-anxious minds may have harbored sneaking suspicions. A few unscrupulous politicians had already employed insider knowledge to shift their personal wealth away from the danger of financial collapse. But most were either ignorant or in denial. No one could have quite predicted the extent of the profound economic and social shock that was about to launch itself on an unsuspecting world. As I mentioned, one of the reasons why I was particularly delighted that Postgrowth won the Eric Zencey Prize was because in the interim between having it been awarded and talking to you tonight, I read Eric's book, and I read it actually in one sitting. I just sat down thinking it would be good to know a little bit about the man whose prize I was winning, and I found it absolutely riveting. It's a page-turning thriller, and it sets out to entertain. But Panama is also shot through with a deep sense of history, and in particular of the history of ideas. And that resonated with me because it was really that sense of a history of ideas, which was one of my principal motivations for writing Postgrowth. And though I had a clear sense of the overall thesis, and the growth critique was something I'd written about extensively, I wanted to ground that thesis in avenues of thought that go back not just decades, but centuries, and occasionally even millennia. I described a little of what I was trying to do in a section from the first chapter of the book called The Journey of the Book. Our prevailing vision of social progress is fatally dependent on a false promise that there will always be more and more for everyone. Forged in the crucible of capitalism, this foundational myth has come dangerously unraveled. The relentless pursuit of eternal growth has delivered ecological destruction, financial fragility, and social instability. Was the myth ever really fit for purpose? It isn't entirely clear. Its fatal misconception lies in assuming that more is always better. While there is still an insufficiency, this assertion stands, conditionally at least. When there is already excess, it categorically doesn't. One of the two critical flaws at the heart of capitalism is our inability to know where this point is. The other is not knowing how to stop when we get there. These flaws are so deeply ingrained that escaping them isn't simple. There's no convenient magic trick to spring ourselves from the trap without shaking the foundations of our own cultural beliefs. The goal of this book is to engage in that task by pulling apart the assumptions coded in capitalism and reframing the underlying propositions. I want to reconstruct the foundations for a post-growth narrative. The journey itself is entangled in the history of thought. That history was created by some extraordinary people. Their lives and struggles provide a way of grounding theory in story. Listened to with respect, they become our guides. I'm not entirely sure whether I chose these characters or whether they chose me, nor could I reliably say that I guided the direction of their narrative. As I wrote, their voices teased me relentlessly away from my original, more simplistic aims and forced me into complexities I hadn't intended to address. These women and men became my intellectual companions. I would lose myself over and again in their lives and their struggles. Not too much, I hope, but enough to arrive occasionally in that liminal space where something unexpected can happen. More often than not, it did. But I was also very aware that the performance of this particular journey has a potential cast of thousands. That there were others I could have chosen is blindingly obvious. That there are voices who are missing is inevitable. This is not ultimately a book of answers. It's a book of questions with some tentative suggestions that happen to emerge from it. Another book written on another day or in a different year might have had a very different cast list. I dare to imagine it might nonetheless have arrived at a similar destination. We are trapped in an iron age of consumerism, but the cage is of our own making. We are locked in the myth of growth, but the key was forged in our own minds. There are physical, material limits to our existence, but there is a creativity in our souls that can free us to live meaningfully and thrive together. These were the principal insights that have emerged from me through endless conversation with my intellectual guides. For different readers, something different may emerge. And if it does, I will consider my assignment a success. So I just wanted, before the final extract, to give you some examples of those intellectual guides and ideas. They included, for example, Bobby Kennedy and a speech he made in Canvas on the very first day of what turned out to be an ill-fated presidential campaign. They included Boltzmann's profound contribution through thermodynamics to ecological economics and his tragic death in 1906. They include Lynn Margulis' groundbreaking work on symbiosis, Hannah Arendt's extraordinary writing on the human condition, Wangari Maathai's activism, Nina Simone's angelic voice and her anger, Thich Nhat Hanh's contemplations on power, and the transcendental poetry of Emily Dickinson. And as I wrote about these people, I began to sense a kind of undercurrent, a connectedness, a story told against the prevailing logic, one that offered us an alternative to the dysfunctional narrative of capitalism. It emerged for me during the writing in quite strange ways, a comparison I found between the philosophy of Arendt's first lover, Martin Heidegger, and the poetry of Emily Dickinson, for example. Or, as in this last extract, a simple coincidence between the date of Kennedy's cancer speech and a viral tweet from the COVID lockdown. Of course, that connection is in part just my narrative, my construction, but it gave me a sense that the tide of history still carries us and nourishes us if we allow it to. Tuesday, 17th of March, 2020, St. Patrick's Day. It was 52 years to the day since Bobby Kennedy had stepped down onto the Kansas tarmac to launch his ill-starred presidential campaign. 2 weeks into Italy's coronavirus lockdown, a strange and wonderful rumor began to circulate on social media. There were signs that nature was already recovering from the onslaught of incessant economic activity. Dolphins had been sighted in the canals of Venice. The next day brought some even more extraordinary news. A group of elephants had wandered into a village in the province of Yunnan, China, drunk themselves silly on corn wine, and passed out in a nearby tea field. Both stories went viral. An excitable meme accompanied them on their journey through the virtual universe. The earth is healing. Nature has pushed the reset button. Sometimes it was accompanied by a more sinister echo. We are the virus. Without us, was the implication. Nature will be just fine. A few days after the two stories broke, National Geographic magazine published an article debunking them. The reports were false, they revealed. This was just a hoax, simple as that, fake news. No dolphin is stupid enough to risk its health in Venetian canal water, even now. Readers were furious for different reasons. Wow, said one, this is so like telling your kids Santa isn't real right after the child happily sat on Santa's lap in the mall. Why would you spoil our lives with truth when fantasy is so much more palatable? Others decried the perpetrators. People will do anything to get likes, they said. A host of spoof replicas followed. Satirical news outlet The Onion published an article claiming that white rhinos had taken over downtown Manhattan. One bright spark relayed the Earth is healing meme alongside a post of colorful dolphins cavorting in what he claimed was the Hudson River. The image was in fact a vibrant psychedelic design by the graphic artist Lisa Frank. Bizarrely, a picture of goats descending on the town of Llandudno in Wales turned out to be genuine. And in Arizona, a family of javeliners really did come down from the hills and venture into someone's backyard. There were blue skies in Beijing during a season accustomed mainly to unadulterated smog. A mountain range in the Himalayas was visible for the first time in 30 years from the Indian province of Punjab, 200 kilometers away. Dolphins had actually been sighted, apparently, at a port in Cagliari, Sardinia. Less miraculous, but still unusual. A healing of sorts really was happening somewhere, it seemed. Lazy news channels first sensationalized the stories themselves, and then, peeved at being duped, faithlessly celebrated their debunking. Some made out that all of it was evidence that nobody could be trusted. With everyone confined to their homes, a deep fake conspiracy was stealing the last shred of sanity from overwrought citizens, the ability to distinguish between fact and fiction. Some of that may well have been going on. Extinction Rebellion notoriously, some might say amusingly, circulated a video of the Belgian premier saying that immediate action is necessary to tackle the climate and environmental crisis. It is, of course, but she didn't actually say it, sadly. Some of the fake may even have originated from those in high places desperate to spin dark situations to their own advantage. Fake is the currency of confusion. Confusion is the foundation for control. But when it came to the dolphins, well, there was a simpler, kinder explanation. The original tweet had been in Italian, and it had been perfectly clear. Clean water in Venice, swans in Milan, dolphins in Cagliari. Some of the confusion was just simple mistranslation. Some was hasty repetition. The principal culprit was that most profound of human sentiments, hope. Hope is the thing with feathers, wrote the poet Emily Dickinson, that perches in the human soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for allowing me to introduce you a little bit to post-growth, and many thanks again for this award. It means a lot to me.
Thanks so much, Tim. Amazing passages and super relevant points to right now, of course. So again, without further ado, I want to move us into the Q&A time, which I hope is going to be really interesting for everybody. To moderate that, we have Rubeina Anjum. Rubeina is a PhD student at UVM. She's studying climate and environmental policies and their impact on welfare and inequality in Asia, East and South Asia. She's already got degrees in civil engineering and environmental management, and she's worked at the World Bank on a lot of these relevant issues, climate resilience and greenhouse gas accounting and so forth. And she's going to take over and moderate the Q&A session. And I'll just say, and one last thing, in the chat was a reminder about how people online can ask those questions. And that's with the Q&A function, Q&A box of this Zoom webinar. So please ask your questions there, and Rubeina can moderate those and bring them forward to Tim. Okay, over to you, Rubeina.
Thank you, Taylor. And thank you, Tim, for sharing some of your book with us today. I really enjoyed reading it earlier this summer. And so okay, we've got some questions coming in. So Dave Grace asks, from your perspective as an author, what is the role of fiction and nonfiction writing to the public in spreading the message of ecological economics?
Thanks for that. It's a great question. I think I've struggled with that throughout my professional careers. I think Josh was mentioning when he talked about my CV, Taylor was mentioning when he talked about my CV, I started life actually as a playwright, writing fiction, basically. And I thought that's the way that my career would go, until really chance circumstances had me working almost accidentally as an economist. And throughout that time, as I've been working in economics, I've always been torn by that that function of fiction, actually, to provide a different way of talking about the issues. And I think, I believe, personally, I believe it's a really incredibly important one. And I think it plays a variety of different functions. One is that it keeps, well, from a personal perspective, I found that the writing of fiction, the playwriting kept me sane in a world in which actually the non-fiction writing, the ecological economics, has an occupational hazard in terms of one's sense of looking at intractable problems over a long period of time, where you need to have some sort of outlet. And I know that's an experience shared by many of my colleagues working in ecological economics. And those outlets, of course, can be various. I mean, we're driven, ecological economists, largely by our love of nature. And so being outside and in nature and doing physical things there is one of the places that we can go for solace. But another place I think that we can go for solace is fiction and the world of the arts. And I think what the world of the arts brings to us and should bring to us and should continually remind us of is a connection to not just our own humanity, but our humanity in perspective, seen in the long run, seen as part of a culture that we have to, in some way, continually reinvent as humans, as human beings, in order to find a sense of progress. And I think in a sense, that in a non-fiction way, we can talk about progress and we can talk about a different vision. We can tell stories, even narratives about people who existed and who had amazing ideas. And that was a part of what I was trying to do in Post-Growth. But in fiction, actually, we can use our creativity to visualize our place in society and to visualize that future in ways that are not only that can reach more people, because not everyone likes books about ecological economics. I can't think why, but they tend not to, as a whole, seek out books in ecological economics, but they do and always will seek out story and vision and the drama that plays itself out through history and through contemporary culture. And that's a place where, I found this, I think, in Eric's book, that, it was clearly a book that had been written by someone who had an enormous sense of that history and of the place of humanity in history, and of the critical importance of culture and cultural ideas in driving history forward. But he couched the entire book as a thriller, a detective story set in Paris during the late 1800s. And it was a perfect vehicle, really, for an argument that underran that story about the clash of culture that was happening at that time, a culture that had been at one time embedded deeply in the institutions of religion, and that had been to some extent overturned by an emergent culture of steam and coal and industrial power. And although his story just looks like a detective story and you can sit down and read it in a day, that underlying narrative actually sits with you for longer than if he had just talked about that narrative. And the story sits with you longer as well, because it isn't just a detective story. It's a story about cultural evolution and our place in history. So to me, I guess, the answer to your question in a kind of long roundabout way is, I think we need both those things, and they can go together very powerfully and reinforce each other in our quest for a transition to a better society.
Thank you, Tim. I think that resonates with a lot of us, even those of us who are maybe working more with quantitative analysis. We find ourselves thinking more about the storytelling inevitably, because there's no other way that we can continue working on this without some sort of motivation deeper than all the facts and data tell us. And we have, and Francesca Snelling brings up Amitabh Ghosh's The Great Derangement as well, and says that the climate crisis is a crisis of the imagination. So thank you for that comment, Francesca. And along this line, Keith Epstein asks, what can individual people do to help achieve the post-growth vision despite the immense challenges and lack of control over the global economic system?
Yeah, that's another great question, and something that I deal with a little bit in the book. And in fact, in some ways, it allows me to sort of tell one of the stories that motivated the book, which was a conversation that I had with a young man who was working for a company and had sent round an email to that company saying that he was going to resign from the company because even though he was working in what was supposed to be sustainability, he just read Prosperity Without Growth, and he realized that we had to do something much more ambitious. And that would all have been fine were it not for the fact that I had arrived at that company on that day to advise on sustainability. And so I had an interesting first day in that advisory panel, but I also had a fascinating conversation with that young man, and his name was Benoit Ost, and he actually did give up his job, go and work to build a community, a sustainable community, an intentional community where people were desperately trying to create that alternative life, something better. And of course, not everybody can do that. There are people who can, afford or have enough courage to go off and live in a way that's more consistent with the transition that we're trying to create. But that doesn't exhaust the possibility for what people can do. In fact, people, I think, can work towards that transition in lots of different kinds of ways. And that particular man chose no longer to be working in that company because he didn't believe it was creating change. But many people who continue to work in that company do actually believe in their ability to create that change and can create that change, and together, working together in those different ways, both within and without, and in resistance and in collaboration, and sometimes, as I mentioned in the book, in outright civil disobedience, protesting on the streets. These are all things that individuals can do. One of the conversations in the book is about power and what power means. And there is a temptation to think that we can do nothing in the face of the fierce resistance of incumbent institutions, very powerful institutions. And I think that's wrong. And to some extent, Greta Thunberg showed us that that is wrong. And the sense in which individual power can be cast in a material sense or in a spiritual sense, as Thich Nhat Hanh cast it in The Art of Power, is a profoundly different way of thinking about what we can do as individuals. We are necessarily constrained by what we feel to be our culture, and yet at the same time, we are free, creative spirits in a world of change. And it isn't the same recipe for everybody, but there is always something that anyone can do to make their own life more consistent with a more sustainable, more equitable future for humanity. And I think holding on to that possibility is really critical.
Thank you. And then we have Dana Weiser, who says, Tim, that was inspiring. I've not heard such a thread of spirituality from an economist since E.F. Schumacher, and I think they are interested in learning more about the spirituality aspect. But I also, when I was revisiting your book recently, you speak a lot about labor and work, and how we've been eliminating some of the work, or maybe I'm using it interchangeably, but work and sort of trying to give it to machines and trying to enjoy leisure, which doesn't really completely work for us. When you talk about the match in skill versus challenge, and the kind of flow we need to achieve. I see an element of spirituality in that as well. So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. It is, perhaps uncomfortable for an economist to be talking about something which verges on spirituality. And yet I think in a way, if you look back at the history of economics, and one of my case studies, one of my intellectual heroes in the journey was John Stuart Mill. He was, very much a classical economist, an analytical economist. He put forward the theory of utilitarianism, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, a kind of calculus of happiness. And at one point he had a huge, what we would call today a mental crisis, a crisis of mental health, and a sort of a breakdown. And in the middle of that breakdown, he began to question that entire project. And it's very interesting when you read his autobiography about how he was rescued from that project. And he was rescued from it, first of all, interestingly, by poetry, by the poetry of Wordsworth, and in particular poem of Wordsworth, which is called Intimations of Immortality, where Wordsworth begins to talk about our sense of our own spiritual journey, where we've come from, where we're going to, how we lose that connection as we grow up, and how we can regain it sometimes in the strangest ways, and most strikingly, I suppose, through our connection to nature. And that sense, going back to the first question, that art, that fiction can bring us back that connection, I think is really, really important. And to me, what that story brings home is the fact that, an economics divorced from our spirituality, divorced from our connection to ourselves, to our history, to our culture, and to nature itself, is a dry, almost impotent force, which can add up the components of the gross domestic product with extraordinarily accurate predictions and computations. But none of these actually capture, and this was one of the things that Bobby Kennedy said in that Kansas speech, none of them really capture what it means to be human. It measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, said Kennedy, of the calculation of the GDP. So to me, although it's odd to conventional economics and economists, it seems to me that we have to recapture that idea that economics is embedded in our nature. Herman Daly, the late great Herman Daly, of course, pointed out how that economics has to be embedded in nature and in the environment, but it also has to be embedded in our society, in our sense of our humanity, and in our spiritual connections. And that's a part of what I was trying to do in post-growth. And the question that you asked me about work and flow, to me, this was one of the most profound things that I wanted to try to communicate through the book, which is that this vision of a post-growth future is not a hair shirt vision of sacrifice and hardship. Actually, in buying into the story of capitalism and in giving away our sense of humanity and our sense of being profoundly immersed in the work of the world, we've given away the riches, actually, of being human. And that the post-growth vision actually in part is about reclaiming that idea that there is not a world of sacrifice ahead of us, but a world in which we can reclaim that humanity, a world in which we can embed ourselves in tasks. Some of the psychology that I talk about in the book is incredibly resonant in that respect, because it speaks to the idea that as human beings, our most fulfilling experiences come not from some sort of hedonistic pursuit of happiness, but actually from embedding ourselves and our energy and our work in the task of participating in society, of creating a better society, of experiencing extraordinary states of mind in pursuit of an engagement with the world. And I think consumerism is a very shallow imitation of that. It sort of promises happiness, but actually it's built on non-ending discontent. It actually requires us to feel discontent rather than happiness, because if we were to feel content, if we were to feel happy, if we were to feel fulfilled in the world, we'd have no impetus to go out and buy all the stuff that consumerism needs us to go on buying in order for its own success. And so with the economics that we built around this false vision of happiness really is a poor one. It's a thin one, and it does no justice to the depth of what it means to be human and the experiences that human beings, both individually and collectively, can experience. And I think, although that sounds, could be construed as sounding like some rose-tinted vision, utopian perhaps, actually it's grounding in psychology, it's grounding in sociology, it's grounding in anthropology, it's grounding in the wisdom traditions, and the long line of spiritual thinkers is so profound that I became convinced as I was writing that case that actually it's the other version that's simply utopian. The idea that we can somehow as human beings achieve unending happiness through the material satisfactions of glitter and bling just doesn't have any credibility. It isn't a real option for the future. And it is another reason, I think, why the post-growth vision is a vision that is more realistic and indeed more fulfilling than anything that we have through consumer capitalism.
So Cheryl Herrick-Carmi has a question about how we can use storytelling to drive action rather than making it more passive. And I wanted to add something to this. So just since you brought up consumerism, so how can we, tell a different story even about consumerism, because we've been sort of almost indoctrinated into, as you said, psychologically through marketing campaigns, and this whole culture has now evolved into this desiring more things. And what sort of alternative story can we tell to change this narrative?
Yes, the story, generally speaking, I think storytelling can be incredibly powerful, as I was reflecting on a little bit earlier. One book particularly that struck me recently, and I don't know if anyone has read it, but The Ministry for the Future, which is a book by Kim Stanley Robinson, is extraordinary. He's a science fiction novelist, but actually through Ministry of the Future, he's created or become, central within a realm of fiction, which is now becoming known, I understand recently, as cli-fi, climate fiction. And much of that has a sort of science fiction element to it. And Ministry for the Future is an extraordinary book because it does bring together a lot of what we would actually call non-fiction, but directly imports it into a fictional story about the future and about humanity tackling climate change. So that's one way in which, that storytelling can go places that an academic economist dare not tread. And it can do so in a way that reaches many more people and can be profoundly effective. But I think at a sort of smaller level, not all prize-winning novelists, but we all actually are embedded in story from day one. We are embedded in a culture of consumerism. And so, recently, for example, we're told the story that if we only just go out and buy as much as we can on a particular day, we'll make huge savings and we'll keep the economy going. And the day, Black Friday, which comes, just after Thanksgiving in the US, is a sort of extraordinary abomination. It's a celebration of a story that is simply false, and that leaves us feeling kind of distasteful about the way that the culture in which we can celebrate the abundance of the earth and its support for us on one day can be followed by now go out and spend as much as possible and queue for as long as you can and save money to buy everything that you could possibly can on this one day. Except, of course, this one day has now become a week at least. We don't just have Black Friday, we have Black Friday week, whatever that might mean. But are we confined to that story? I don't think we are. And I think, there is, although fewer people know about it, there is a day in the year called Buy Nothing Day, which is, a great sort of alternative story. It's a story that allows us to connect with the fact that buying things is not all that we are as human beings. It's a day that allows us to resist, in fact, to resist the story that's being told to us and forced on us. And I think that sense of resistance, that sense that we all have a creative power to tell ourselves and to tell other people a different story is a really important one. And Buy Nothing Day and the work of people like Adbusters, and actually I know people who are trying to buy almost nothing other than what it takes to eat for an entire year. These are crazy stories, but they are also, you know, powerful tales of resistance in a world that tries to force us into a very specific story, which really isn't ours at all.
Thank you for that. And Bob Devine asks how perspectives such as yours are being received by mainstream economists and politicians today. And then also just another question from Erwin Driesen of how your thinking also has evolved since Prosperity Without Growth, which I haven't read.
Yeah, thank you for those. How is it being? They sort of go together in a way. Prosperity Without Grace was a more academic book. It was written. It started its life as a report to the UK government, and the report was very specifically asking the question of whether it was needed at that time to kind of revisit the limits to growth arguments, to revisit the arguments that Herman Daly had put forward in the 1970s, and to ask again whether really a growth-based economy was a good way to think about prosperity, whether it could deliver prosperity, and whether there was another way to think about prosperity. And the fact that it was written kind of, you know, by a government think tank, an economist working for a government think tank, and it reported formally to the Prime Minister at the time, who was Gordon Brown, was quite strange in all sorts of ways. In the first place, no formal government body had ever asked that question in that way at that time, and so it was a fairly risky thing to do, actually. And from a personal point of view, I kind of felt sometimes the force of the displeasure of the establishment from asking such questions. In fact, the Friday before the book was published, I was phoned up by the person who had been our liaison person in government as we were preparing it, telling me that number 10 in a certain street in London had gone ballistic because it had just discovered that we were about to launch this report. And the launch was therefore a really kind of strange event. The publicity that we'd all done in advance, all the reaching out to newspapers and radio and TV outlets, none of it appeared when the book appeared. It just died. It just kind of disappeared into the ether. And there was a deadening silence when Prosperity Without Grace was first published. And it was quite extraordinary. It was the most extraordinary launch of any report or any book or any paper that I've ever written. And then very slowly, there was a kind of groundswell of public realization that it was the point at which, downloads from the internet became a kind of more important thing than the physical reports themselves. And the report was downloaded hundreds of thousands of times within the first month or so. And that conversation that was launched on the back of that was something I found humbling. It was extraordinary at the time. And I kind of thought, even as I was writing the book, I thought all I have to do is, make these arguments logical and produce the evidence, and then set forth a few policies and policy directions that government could follow, and everything would therefore change. And when that silence, first that political silence, and then the popular resonance of the book and of the ideas in that report emerged, I began to feel something slightly different, that you can make all the rational arguments that you want, you can present them in policy reports, you can go to endless meetings, as I did at the time as economics commissioner, and actually you can still have very little impact. And it wouldn't be true to say that that impact didn't exist, but it's an impact of a very different kind than that rational model of speaking truth to power and having power listen to you and change as a result of it. It was a model that meant much more, that it was about reaching hearts and minds, that it was about stimulating conversations, that it was about stirring up controversy. And I did somehow manage to stir up a lot of controversy by questioning that growth in that particular way. And it made me realize also that as we kind of hunger for that change, we have to somehow kind of give up our own desire to be the agent of change. We have to hand it over. We have to bring in others along the journey. We have to inspire people who've never thought about economics. We have to move ourselves along a journey that even we don't know what the destination is or where we're going, and we have to do that with a kind of almost with a sense of blindness, of not entirely knowing where we are or what's going to happen next. And that sense has kind of carried with me, I think, through 13 years, and certainly up to the point where I sat down to write post-growth. And I've seen extraordinary change. I mean, I have seen people who are now prepared to question growth, and the emergence of the concept of degrowth, which now has a lot of currency, popular currency, and almost every day you can find someone out there writing in, CNN or New Yorker or New York Times, mainstream publications about the concept of degrowth. Vanity Fair was one that came out recently, and so this sense, in fact, of an alternative dialogue has now picked up and multiplied, and it's gone in all sorts of different directions. It's become something that is now possible to talk about, and yet there is still that kind of sense of a resistance. Still, I can go into a meeting, as I did last week, actually, in a business meeting, and find CEOs or board directors looking at me with daggers because I've dared to question what is the most fundamental thing that their worldview rests upon. And that's an uncomfortable place to be, but actually it's a place that actually, we have to kind of have a sense of humility. So my thinking, the way that my thinking has changed, I think, is in two ways. One is bring this story, bring this to ground it in our humanity. And the other is recognize, and I did do this in Prosperity Without Growth 13 years ago, that it's a profound dilemma, that we're not situated in an easy place where a slogan like degrowth is going to solve all our problems. Our societies are built around a kind of dependency on growth. And that dependency isn't just institutional, it's also cultural. And it was that cultural dependency that I was mostly trying to get to in post-growth, and to understand that even as we dismantle that dependency, we bring to the fore enormous opportunities for cultural change, and a change that will be better for us, not worse for us.
There's Taylor has a question. Did you begin this book before COVID-19 struck? And if so, how did it change your perspective and the book itself? And I wanted to also add, after we've seen sort of this, at least stock market and real estate market growth over the whole lockdown period and a little bit after, but now we're sort of, economists are undecided whether we're in recession or not, and the Fed's hiking up interest rates. And from it went to, stay at home, and here's stimulus checks, and at least in the wealthier countries, to now you have to come back to work, horrible working conditions. So how do you feel about this, even like compared to when you wrote the book?
Great questions. Two slightly different questions in a way. I'll treat them differently. I mean, yes, I started writing post-growth before anyone knew about COVID. I think I'd written 3 or 4 chapters before that meeting in Davos that I described. And yes, it changed things. In some ways, it changed the way that the book was written and the context which was written in obvious ways, as those excerpts that I read earlier sort of suggest. It also, I think, brought home very, very vividly how those that we relied on most during COVID were the people in the economy that conventional economics least valued. They had the lowest pay, the most insecure working conditions, very little economic security. And you know, that sense actually that economics fails those people, I think, was one of the huge lessons of COVID, and the extraordinary perverseness, which is actually also tragic, that the COVID crisis taught us which parts of society are invaluable, which cannot be dispensed with, and that many of the people who are working in those sectors have been so poorly treated. And actually, one of the puzzles that I was looking at in post-growth and haven't finished looking at it is actually the kind of center of the puzzle for the next book that I'm working on, is the sense in which formal economics, as we have inherited, simply cannot provide a framework in and of itself which protects those people, protects their livelihoods, protects the value that we must attribute as society to the work that's been done there. And it was really, you know, a lot of my feeling around that was driven by this work that Hannah Arendt did on the nature of work and labor and the way that capitalism denigrates both in society. And I think the job actually of protecting that part of society which creates this work, both in terms of looking after ourselves and looking after other people, caring for each other, and also the job of work in building a sense of continuity and durability and sustainability in the world in the face of our own mortality. These two tasks are absolutely central to humanity and to our own progress. And yet economics, as we have it, systematically undermines both of them. And that's, you know, that is a huge, profound challenge. And I think it goes on. I think the economics that we're seeing at the moment is the continuation of our failure to look at those issues. And of course, superficially, you could say, well, no, it's about the war in Ukraine. But actually, war itself is a kind of nemesis that emerges out of our failure to address that economy of care and connection and creativity that could provide us a better kind of society. Care and nemesis are kind of, you know, the care and war are kind of polar opposites that, and at the moment, you know, our default into a world of conflict, our default into a world driven by inequality in which the poorest in society cannot even feed themselves and keep themselves warm, must choose between warmth and food. And on the other hand, in which, you know, the power of the stock market, as you were suggesting, Rubina, to kind of perpetuate itself and see extraordinary growth through a year in which the livelihoods of those ordinary people were suffering immensely, is a profound indictment of our current economic system. That work is not finished, I guess, is what I'm saying. We are nowhere near, even with all the positive vision that I've tried to bring together through alternative narratives and fantastic intellectual ideas in the context of post-growth. That work to reform the economy is profoundly important. And it feels to me like one of those social and cultural struggles in which we're defining our own future. And it's not usual to speak of it as a cultural challenge, because actually there is, of course, also a technological challenge. We have to revise our energy systems, we have to reform them, we have to transform them away from fossil fuels. But actually beneath the carbon story, beneath the story about a carbon transition, is a story about a cultural transition. And I think, you know, post-growth and anything else that I've done has scratched the surface of that at best, and is a hugely critical task for the future.
Thank you. And we've had a lot of great questions, but I think we're close to time. So Tim, any closing comments from you?
No, I think you know, thank you for this evening. Thank you for all of those great questions. One thing that strikes me, and I'm really pleased about, because quite often when I talk about post-growth, people want to talk about all the practical things that you can do, which I like to think I covered off in Prosperity Without Growth. And the deeper, harder questions about culture, cultural transition, the role of story, the narratives that sustain us, the importance of spirituality, the importance of holding our own humanity in focus. Those were the things that I wanted to do in post-growth, and those are the things that many of the questions have focused on this evening. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about that. And as I mentioned before, this book particularly was a very personal project for me, in part because it brought together that element of myself as a storyteller and the element of myself as an ecological economist. And it's therefore a real privilege. I feel very honored that the Eric Zencey Prize has been awarded to that book. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Tim Jackson. Yeah, let's give a little round of applause in this virtual, quiet, muted way. Sorry we couldn't do this in person, but it's been fantastic to see how many people have joined in from all over the place to listen to your words, Tim. And it falls to me to just say thanks very much for writing this book, for being the thinker that you are and the writer that you are, that's able to kind of share these ideas with people in such a approachable and moving way. I really, really enjoyed the book. And to just say that, like everybody, I think that knew Eric, I was thinking about him this whole hour and 15 minutes about how much he would have enjoyed listening to this, reading this book, talking to you. And so it's just a wonderful confluence of a prize that continues Eric's work, but that also brings what recognition we can offer to a fantastic piece of writing. So with that, thanks very much, Tim, and for everyone who came and joined us today. Great congratulations, and I can't wait to see what you write next.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Have a great rest of your evening or day, and keep it up, everybody.
All right, thanks all. Thanks very much, Tim. Here.